Yeah, so, hey, by the way, the border police.
Can't hear you.
I said the Canadian government.
The people from the border went to your aunt's house in Ottawa.
Yeah, the government.
Looking for you.
Yeah, but I wasn't there. Mother told me that she told them that I left over a year ago. I haven't been.
Yeah. Well, that's what I told Citizenship and Immigration, that you were trying to call them, but your phone didn't work from the U.S.
Yeah.
So I guess they passed the message on.
When did you find out about this place? What, Tempe called?
It was, there is a series of new videos being put onto television. I don't know if any of it has appeared in the U.S. or not, but it's, most of them seem to be funded by the Canadian government and the networks, telephone, cable TV, networks across Canada, including Rogers, Shaw, Canada, National Film Board of Canada, and it seems to be kind of all being produced by the same money centered on the government of Canada. And it has some participation by England, but I don't think I've seen any mention of America. There are a number of different programs, and some of them are called The Secrets of Museums or Museum Secrets. Some are called Naked Archaeologist out of Toronto, and others have specific names related to lost information. It seems to be done in cooperation with Israel, but a lot of it is basically rewriting the history of Israel, and it kind of seems to be done for the purpose of denying many of the things that have been believed in the past. And I would suggest that if all of the videos were put together into one series, it would be called Revisionist in the context of what has been told to date. Now, most of it takes place in the time from Jesus basically to the Crusades. However, there's the odd one, and especially this one that I saw on Sunday night, And they played it 2 or 3 times on the same day. A number of these are played over and over again on History Channel, on documentary channels, on military channels, and they seem to be in a hurry trying to get all of that information out to Canadians. I don't know if any of that has appeared in the U.S. That's what I would like you to find out. Now, the Prime Minister of Canada is spending the week in the Middle East. He's there now. He addressed the Parliament of Israel yesterday, defended Israel totally. So one has to wonder why they're doing all of this at this particular time. Rewriting things that happened in Egypt. But the most interesting one was the one that was done on Sunday, which basically sets out in a monument type of place, something like they have in England, but much older. This begins in a time approximately 10,000 to 12,000 BC. You can basically put that in context when you say 10 to 12,000 BC compared to 3,000 or 3,100 BC when Egypt began to exist. So a difference of about 9,000 years older. And it basically comes about at the end of the Ice Age, before anyone else is talked about as civilians. And they change the beginning of civilization, if you will, within the context of hunter-gatherers, whereas most historians have described the beginning of civilization with agriculture, which basically comes down to human beings purposefully growing food for the purpose of feeding an army who would then control an area called the kingdom. But hunter-gatherers, they say, are the real beginning of what happens, because they too gather food. The only difference is they didn't plant it. It was already growing, and what they do is gather it and store it. And from there, they can begin to control people using the food they have when other people no longer have it. And it's based upon a religious, ritualistic premise. It lays out what one would call 2 pillars in the middle of a big stone circles. These pillars are about 18 feet tall. And from 18 feet tall, for these two pillars in the center, they are surrounded by a number of other pillars, because they reproduce this concept on a number of occasions, and different numbers of pillars surrounding the main pillars can vary from 12, 14 area down to 5 or 6, depending on the size of the place in which they put them up. They have been basically excavated and found that once they covered it up, they built another one smaller on top, covered it up, built another one smaller than that, and that basically gave the concept of having temples, starting with the biggest is the oldest, and the smallest is a local farm community type church. So religion, in the context of what people did 10,000 BC or so, is at the center of it. The gathering, hunter-gatherers, the gathering of wheat or barley or whatever in order to control the food that already exists that they didn't plant, is the beginning of controlling the world. This is in eastern Turkey, near a few hundred miles from the Euphrates River, beginning of the Euphrates River, which would put it in the area, I would suggest, of Lake Van, which for a long time has been discussed as the place where about 5,000 years later there is Noah's Ark, the story of Noah's Ark coming to an end. But they go through what appears to be a revisionist version of how everything began, that would lead basically to a time later on when northern Syria of today would become a center of activity between Babylon on the east and Egypt in the west, creating a kind of a pyramid, because and Egypt's Giza Plateau are about on the same parallel, whereas northern Syria at the end of the Euphrates River is much further north. And it could explain why today the people of Syria are being killed by their own government. Their own government is not being stopped by any Western or Eastern society, even though it's obvious that the war there is ethnic cleansing. They're getting rid of the Syrians who know what becomes the question. It's in the same manner that the Civil War in the U.S. occurred. A number of people in the U.S. knew what had gone on in the past and had to be cleansed, so that you have a war between the North and the South and a war against Indians. So slavery would come into play, and people who knew that slavery was not to get people in to, in fact, grow cotton and collect cotton on behalf of some rich guy, but more brought in as a gene pool by the Arabs who collected the slaves in Africa and shipped them off to America, so that when this time in history came about, those gene pools could be merged in with the Aboriginal gene pools, with the white gene pools, and with the brown gene pools and the black gene pools, all mixed up together in order to make a new gene pool that they knew from the beginning would be needed at this time. The only difference is they were doing it there in Turkey because they had access in Turkey to Neanderthals. Also had access to women from Africa. Much later on, got access to Egyptian women who basically left with Moses but turned left, while the men turned right and went and lived in the deserts, Jordan, for 40 years, until most of them had died and were replaced by a new generation of Jordanian types rather than Egyptian types. They would then move to Israel to find a new gene pool had been created by the Syrians, artificially inseminating the women who had gone from Egypt with Moses, turned left, went into what we call Israel, and from there gave birth to a specific gene pool, which eventually we got to know as Judeo-Christian. It basically means that Jews can change their religion to Christianity. Christians can become Jews at any time in the future if it's convenient to hide who they really are. When a certain group of people who know too much need to be removed, then one will remove them by war, pestilence, famine, or disease, or a combination of all four. which one would call a holocaust. Really, it's cleansing a gene pool of certain people whose genetics have too much information. Eliminating any arguments. This is happening at a period at least 7,000 years before what we call civilization. It's after the Ice Age and before the Bible. The Bible describes civilization as beginning with Adam and Eve at about 4,000 BC. And this is happening in the period around 12,000 BC. Could be anywhere from 13 to 11,000 BC. They set down the parameters of how they wanted this to exist. And what you see is male-female are the two pillars in the center, and around them are what one would call the direction in which they would go. The smaller pillars. Right away it struck me that if you're describing the direction of things, you are in fact reflecting a central place with many facets that would send the light in different directions. And that's a cut diamond. And the reason why they use the diamond as the central feature of knowledge, the bigger the diamond, the more information you've been given, type of thing, about what really happened and why you're on the journey that you're on. And then a breastplate made up of birthstones basically describes your task orientation. If you're a garnet, you have a different task orientation than somebody with a different birthstone.
Are you able to decipher, like, say, like people
yeah.
Emeralds?
I can hardly hear you.
I said, are you able to decipher, like, those birthstone things? Because people like me, they say, I'm born in May, and I'm...
Well, it's easy to decipher what your task orientation will be if the person who's making you is a genetic engineer and he's removing from your genetics things that are inappropriate to the need and inserting into the genetics the things that are appropriate to the tasks they want you to do. And the whole concept of horoscope is that people born between certain dates have similar task orientations or personality traits is how they call it. But the more you begin to mix the two, the the more you change the orientation as you go along. If somebody was oriented towards being a doctor and all doctors were being made in, say, the month of March, another group was oriented towards becoming a carpenter, and at a stage later on you merge the two of them, then you can change the orientation that way as the number of tasks diminish in size because of the extra number of people doing them. You become like an assembly line. Everybody's a minute specialist. In any event, what it describes basically is that if you're going to do this genetic engineering, you begin with a certain class of people, and you do your testing on that class, which today we call royals. And then you extend that genetic engineering into a larger group of people that you would call religious. And eventually, through a democratic process, extend it into the masses. But the manufacturers of the people must keep control over the genetics of the masses. Therefore, they kind of create a state, and later states within the state, so that they can have some sense of the personality and task orientation by specialists in different parts of the world. You get certainly the sense that Vermont task orientation and mentality, the people, generally speaking, living in Vermont, is different from that of those of Texas, and that New York is different from California. But if you understand the concept that is defined by this group in 12,000 BC, they knew that they were starting with a small population and would control the genetic development of the population as the numbers grew, because they, in order to solve their need, having lived before the Ice Age and having done things without any kind of knowledge of where it would all end up, had the advantage then of knowing where they did end up and compare that to where they wanted to end up, and then use the period following the Ice Age to specifically direct the gene pools towards the end game they want to play after this period in time. It was always done with the concept of you build a gene pool, you assign it a task, you watch it develop, and if it's not going in the direction you want today, you destroy it. You do that through war, pestilence, famine, and disease and a combination thereof. What they wanted was 7 billion people where they could kill them at will. And at one stage of the game, changed the rules to have 7 billion people living at the same time. See the difference of how things develop, and all of them are there at the same time, compared to as you no longer need a certain group and got rid of them, your numbers were much smaller at any single time, people who were alive, compared to today, when as many people are walking alive on the planet today as have lived and died on the planet before. Noah's Ark is the model, basically, of what they had in mind. You start off at the year 4000 BC, and 600 years later, you don't like what you see, so you destroy them by a flood. And that destruction basically is what we, on the other hand, are at the end of. We're at the end times where things now are known, recorded, tested, retested, and you can separate hypothesis from theory, hypothesis being an idea, theory being a proven idea. Now that you have all of the proven ideas of 7 billion people who lived and died, plus 7 billion people who are alive at the same time today, and you have all that knowledge compressed into the last 300-400 years, to have arrived at the point where, okay, we know what we need to have in order to go and do what we want to do in the future, which is to explore the universe. We know what kind of person would fit in an iPod, a pod for 1p, send it out on an exploratory mission into one part of the universe, send out another, and make them as fast as you can track their development in some other place. The cheapest, most economical way to do that is to go back to the beginning of making human beings, the same way as trees had come about, and make them able to clone themselves. Therefore, that basically means that male must re-enter the female, so that the male can provide the infrastructure while the female provides the veneer, the outer appearance, And then you add the third part, which is the technology elements within that automaton called a new human being or weeman, small man, wee man, hidden inside a larger structure that appears to be female, is the concept of Troy. And infiltrate without anyone realizing what they're dealing with here. They think they're dealing with a woman, but in fact they're dealing with a conglomerate, male, female, and technology. And of course, that means the technology would have ground positioning device in it, would have a radio communications type of activity where they can listen in and broadcast what they're listening in back to headquarters in real time. The diamond showing the facets, the directions, determines basically what their basic place is and allows them to adapt to if it's a place that is covered in water, the person can recall the ability to live in water, separating oxygen from the water itself, and operate freely in that environment. If the place is cold or far, far away, then you can have a dormant stage, such as they have, the European Agency has just reawakened a dormant satellite that is about to land on a meteor. The individual is hermaphroditic in operation. It can clone itself if allowed to do it. Now, that means it has the necessary parts to it to bring together the male-female aspects and reproduce, as long as the technology included in the body says it's time, it's okay now, you can do that now. But when they don't want it to happen, such as they want to shut down a colony, they can shut it down from a distance by remote control. But I thought it was the most interesting view ever expressed on media, and every time I see one of the programs, it tells me we're living at a time approaching 2020 when everyone needs to know how and why they're here.
They're telling everyone this is part of a ritual, in a sense?
Yeah. Christianity is basically a scapegoat religion. So it's saying you will die so that a better version of you can live. And you are a flawed person because you don't have the capabilities that are technically possible in a human being that travels in space, lands on a meteor, explores it, calls back home, tells them what they have, and can build a colony if there's something worthwhile, or be killed off if there's nothing of any value at this stage in the development of knowledge back on Earth. We might...
These shows, were they, what was the name of these shows?
I'm unable to tell you exactly what it was because it was only on TV and I didn't write down the title of it. But it was basically a place in Turkey whose name ends with a word called Tepe, T-E-P-E. They didn't have that name in the title of the show, but they were advertising it as 7,000 years before Egypt.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Glenn. Right. About barbarians. Right. You know what bats barbarians are made out of? What?
Well, the barbarians and the beginning of all of this seems to be centered on the name Bedouin. The Bedouin were the people of North Africa. They traveled back and forth from what we would consider places like Morocco, all across North Africa, to the Middle East, and then up into northern Syria. Some are referred to as the Berbers. The B-E-R and the E can be interchanged with an A, basically link it to rabbi, the teachers, or Barbara. Bra contains the knowledge gathered by the brain in the same way as memory, small memory can be plugged into a computer and draw down from the hard drive to portable hard drives. And that's the purpose of the mammary on the breast, is to keep backup information that is not in current use, but is important to remember.
too, like in the word barbarian.
I'm not hearing you well.
I said I've been seeing that a lot, like in a lot of words.
Yeah.
Important words.
Well, at the beginning, when you want to take control, you need a bunch of people who are barbaric and cannibalistic in their approach to doing things. The word lucerne, alfalfa, is the two names of the same thing, are about barbarians and cannibals. And in Washington in January, there is a dinner party for a select group of people called the Alfalfa Club. It's basically to say, without saying, that these are the important people, and they bring a guest which they want to introduce to the larger group. They have a meal someplace in a hotel in Washington, and apparently the meal is always the same thing. Never has the menu changed from the creation of the club. I always wondered if some of that meal may be human flesh. Or derivatives thereof. Maybe human flesh which was fed to wild boars. That way they could claim that it's pork.
Like in
Hey?
So people in Hollywood movies like Hannibal Lecter,
Yeah.
stuff like that, are they?
It's a play on actual occurrences. Movies are made to give you a false memory, so that should you come across the truth, they could deny that it is in fact the truth, but rather something you saw in a movie.
Now, it was only a select group of people in the past who were cannibals, right?
No, the cannibals can be normal people under abnormal circumstances. You've certainly heard about airplane crashes on top of mountains where the passengers who survived ate the dead. The same thing exists in war, where there is no food, period, and people revert back to cannibalism in order to survive by killing their neighbors and eating them, or in fact taking their own relatives that have died. There is a saying that goes something like, why would you be a cannibal? And the answer is that because the meat tastes good and they're easy to catch.
Oh.
Apparently, all animals are taste differently if you're eating the muscle, but all the insides, liver, kidney, all of that stuff, heart, all taste the same.
Oh, if you were just eating.
So that's the kind of programming they're putting on in Canada.
I was looking on my phone,
And that's the kind of programming that the Navy was trying to extract from Jennifer when they were doing their rituals in California. And the rituals involved people they wanted to blackmail, who would then become senior politicians. And trying to extract Jennifer's memories because of the fact that her original birth was among the Denisovans, which goes back to about 42,000 BC. The Navy needs that information because in the U.S., the Navy has been given responsibility for space. The outer space has been basically described as being similar to water. And therefore, the people with the expertise in water and how to use animals such as dolphins to do work for them is how this world evolves under their control. The center of activity is in Maryland, where National Security Agency and the Navy have headquarters. They collect information in Maryland from all of the hospitals so that person they genetically manufactured can be followed through its life to see exactly how their project is doing, and if it's in distress, why that is and what happened to it. How did they catch the disease? Was it basically handed over to them or picked up on their own? And in fact, what can make them better and what can kill them are all experiments that have to be undertaken, and the data accumulated under the guise of the state headquarters for the Department of Health and centralized under the World Health Organization, better known as the WHO, at the United Nations. That's why nobody is going in to help the Syrians, because their gene pool is too knowledgeable of how Israel came about and who controls Israel but Jordan. The Hashemite kingdom of Jordan controls Israel.
Three kingdoms, right? It was like
Hey?
There were three kingdoms, right? It was Hashemite.
All of them are listening in right now. Whether they be CSC in Canada, Canadian Security, what do they call it? The
Thesis?
Security Establishment are listening in. The CSA in the U.S. is listening in because this is an international call and they claim they have the right to do that. Not for the protection of the American citizen, but for the protection of those genetic engineers who have manufactured the gene pools in the U.S., such as the Gray Nuns in Ogdensburg, New York. Central command for the nuns are in Massachusetts, and details of what they do to people after they are part of a gene pool is kept in Maryland. Every now and then they'll make a specific individual and send them off to New York to live out its life so that they can watch the expertise in the task orientation they gave that individual. The one that always comes to mind is Babe Ruth. Came from Maryland. But of course you could describe it as A-Rod today. The fact that New York has the All-Star Museum is not an accident. Cooperstown. Coop. Chicken coop. Yeah.
You know, for some reason in my mind, Rodman.
He's another one. Denisovan and A-Rod Man.
What was that all about, him going to North
Korea? To prove what they can make a person do. Some to their own benefit, others to make them look like idiots. Of course, drugs and alcohol are always involved when they want to turn somebody who's intelligent or a specialist in something into an idiot, then the remote control is designed to make them use alcohol. In any event, I got to go feed the animals because it's going to be dark in about 20 minutes. Bye for now.
Okay.